Welcome to The Daily. I'm Tom Cheshire. It's been 2 long, grinding years, a war that at this stage might feel never ending. But that in itself is pretty extraordinary. If you think back to the very start of Russia's invasion, a vast column of tanks bearing down on Kyiv, special forces from Russia trying to seize the airport. And Ukraine's fate hung in the balance, but Kyiv didn't fall. It still hasn't fallen. And the mood there, as we'll hear, it's still determined not to give in to Russia. Now, President Zelenskyy famously asked for ammunition, not a ride. Border guards on Snake Island told a Russian warship, the flagship of Russia's Black Fleet no less, to go F itself. And that defiance bred battlefield success. But around 20% of Ukrainian land, including those big cities like Mariupol and Donetsk, is firmly in Russian control. And the front lines have barely budged, despite the promises of last year's offensive. We'll hear from one of the roughly 300,000 Ukrainian refugees who fled here to the UK later. But first, I've been speaking to our correspondent John Sparks, who's in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine. John, you've just been on the front line. It's really compelling reporting.
You can't see the Russians massing in the forest, but you certainly know they're there. Tens of thousands gathering in the trees. Something the members of Ukraine's 32nd Brigade could never match. They took us to a command center a few kilometers from the front east of the city of Kharkiv. And we found long faces.
You're speaking about people looking pretty glum, the ammunition, the supplies dwindling, using hammers to fix this Soviet-era bazooka. This doesn't look like a military that's on the up. It doesn't look like soldiers that are confident of winning.
I think that is a fair assessment, Tom. I think the momentum now is definitely with the Russian military. The momentum is with Putin, really. The Ukrainian troops on the front, particularly in the area where we went, in and around a city called Kupiansk, they are under real pressure. And we saw it. We felt it in a limited way. A lot of these soldiers, they've been there for a long time. They serve these open-ended periods at the front. They don't have the weapons, the ammunition that they need. I mean, we were told by soldiers in one of these bunkers that the ratio is about 10-1. So for every shell the Ukrainians fire, 10 come back from the Russians. And, that must be pretty demoralizing. There's also a manpower issue as well. It's been going on for 2 years. And I was here, Tom, at the very beginning of the war, and I remember in places like Kharkiv, where we are now, tens of thousands of people rushing to the recruitment offices, queuing up for hours and hours to put their names down for military service. And that just isn't happening now. Particularly younger people, they do not want to go to the front. The Ukrainians don't release the casualty numbers, the numbers of deaths out there on the front, but we know it's high. So, you've got this shortage in 2 aspects: ammunition, equipment, and then also in terms of personnel as well. But I think we have to balance it as well, because one of the things that surprised me after spending a couple of days on the front is that I thought morale was actually, all things considered, pretty strong. The people that we spoke to are committed. They're still committed. They're tired. And some people said, hey, look, I haven't, barely seen my family at all over the last 2 years. But people are still dedicated to this cause. It's like they don't really see an alternative to what they're doing. And that was put to us a couple of times. What is the alternative? Do we just hand over the country to Russia? Do we just hand over this place to Putin? This is not a good moment for Ukraine. I think they're vulnerable. I think the Russians sense that, and I think that's why they're throwing a lot of men and a lot of their ammunition into the war at the moment. But I don't think we should get carried away either. The Ukrainians are dug in. Now, I think we're looking really at a brutal year where the Ukrainians will be looking to hold on. It's going to be defensive. I don't think we're going to be talking about major counteroffensives this year, but they're going to be aiming to hold on, to endure, survive even.
You mentioned Ukrainians saying, what's the alternative? I mean, the alternative is just opposite those front lines where you were. It's the huge parts of Ukraine that are still under Russian control. A lot of the work we do, the data and forensics team, is around the places we can't go on the front lines, which is, cities like Mariupol, that's been Russified, really. The torture that's happened in Kherson, people have been abducted and are still been taken into Russia. That's what life looks like under Russian control.
The Russians have deployed this brutal form of warfare that tends to obliterate communities before they are able to take them. And it is clear that they see no future and have no respect for Ukrainian culture, for the Ukrainian language. But, interesting speaking here from Kharkiv, I mean, this is a majority Russian-speaking community. And I think it was quite probable when they began their attack that Putin and his generals thought that they may get some support, some warmth. They may be welcomed in communities like this. And they weren't. And I think that's one of the interesting things that has happened. If there was a debate about Ukrainian identity, about Ukraine's future going forward, about its relationship with Russia, there really is no debate now. This country is incredibly unified on those points, despite the trauma of the last 2 years. People don't want a future with Russia. They see their future in Europe.
I suppose there's different definitions of winning and losing in this conflict. For some, that would be the toppling of the government, but there could also be a settlement which some might see as losing, where Ukraine gives up territory. You say they're in it for the long haul, but are they having those conversations about, what victory, what keeping the country together might look like and might involve giving up territory?
They're not there yet. Those conversations really aren't being held. I don't think that's something at the moment that Ukrainians are prepared to contemplate, quite frankly. I think it's important to say that there are a lot of younger people who don't want any part of this war. I mean, I think we're talking about tens of thousands of people facing conscription, essentially, which comes into place at the age of 27. The Parliament's currently trying to drop that to 25. There are younger people who do not want to go to the front. They don't want a couple of weeks of training that they get and then to land themselves in a trench. And, tens of thousands of people have tried to get out. They've tried to smuggle themselves, or with the use of people smugglers, they've tried to get themselves out to Moldova, to Romania and other countries as well. A far greater number, I think, are hiding out at home in their basements, working, living, trying to keep their profile very low so they don't have to fight. This war is experienced in very different ways by different people. I think the majority are on board. There is a minority that, frankly, don't want to fight and don't want to die.
How much are Ukrainians looking at events abroad, and how much are they worrying about that when they see aid packages being held up in the US, when they see Europe dithering quite a lot, being held to ransom by different countries inside the EU, for instance, the prospect of a Trump presidency? How much attention are they paying to the outside world, and how much does it worry them?
I think Ukrainians are increasingly concerned, particularly about the Americans. I mean, Biden has been reassuring. He says he's going to get the military aid package deal over the line. I think they both are hoping and expecting that to happen. The Europeans have come in with an equivalent deal as well. And that will happen. That will materialize. It's definitely a concern for them. And I think the plan here, not that it's been sketched out in public, but I think this year will be about rebuilding the military, solving their personnel issues. There's this sort of number banded about in Ukraine that the military needs another 500,000 soldiers, or at least 500,000 from which they can choose to put people on the front line. They need that American aid. And I think, will be a new territory if Trump wins the presidency. He shows no indication of wanting to support Ukraine, certainly not in the way that President Biden has done.
Only 10% of Europeans think Ukraine can win the war, according to a recent survey, and the majority think a compromise settlement is likely. So how do you fight a war when the allies who fund and supply you don't think you can win it? We'll pause there, and in a moment we'll hear from a Ukrainian who's been living in the UK for the past 2 years. Welcome back. Now, this weekend marks 2 years since Russia's invasion. But for Anfisa Vlasova, who fled with her 4 dogs, the war's been going on for much longer than that.
Unfortunately, for me, this war has started in 2014, 10 years ago. Just before, I was internally displaced person, and not just me. A lot of people from my region, Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea region, faced this war long time ago.
Very big decision to leave your home country altogether to come to the UK. What prompted that decision in particular to leave the country and to come here?
Because in the beginning, I thought that I will back home to Donetsk. And I really had that hope for a long period of time. That's why I was waiting, sitting in Berdyansk and watching news continuously. And later on, when I faced this war second time, being in Kharkiv, I realized like it's not going to finish soon. If this time it's a full-scale invasion, then I can't feel myself secure in any place in Ukraine anymore, which was really a hard decision because I have never been abroad before. So I didn't know what to expect, how local people will meet me, will they be friendly or not. It's always scary.
And were they friendly? When you got here to the UK, everyone was a bit shocked by the whole full-scale invasion of it. Did you get that sense when you got here, the UK was happy to welcome Ukrainian refugees?
Yes, my first hosts, they're very friendly, welcoming. I was lucky to stay in a very welcoming environment, surrounded by friendly people in a community of villages. So they tried to support all of us as much as they could. And it was really nice to know that someone really cared.
That's amazing to have that sort of welcome. But then, as you're saying, this is a long war. Have you felt that over those 2 years, people not as eager to support Ukraine or just distracted really by other things because it's been going on for so long? Do you feel that attention has slightly waned?
I do feel that because just because of this situation quite long, continue, and for local people, they wasn't ready. I mean, whole Europe wasn't ready. And that's why people expected that, okay, we will support Ukrainians. So that's why in the beginning, people really had a lot of desire to help. And with time, little by little, people get tired. And I can feel it.
We've done reporting on sort of Russian-controlled Ukraine, over these last 2 years. But is that something that you think about moving back to Russian-occupied Ukraine, to Donetsk?
To be frank, I don't think so. The reason is Russia considers those people who spend a lot of time away from those areas since 2014. I mean, Ukraine or Europe, UK, all those places that these people potentially could be dangerous and unreliable. So for these people to find a job later on will be extremely hard because they have to come through checkup of local high police. If they will find out that you were in any of those countries, which I have mentioned above, then you won't be able to get a job. And without getting a job, how are you going to survive? They consider people like we are as an enemy, like criminal people, because we were supporting another part, another side.
Anfisa, thanks so much for speaking to us. Back to you, John, in Kharkiv. We've had 2 years of this war. That is a long time to maintain a united political front domestically. It does feel like we're starting to see some of those cracks appearing. We had President Zelenskyy sacking his top military commander, very popular commander. Are we starting to see those sort of fractures in the domestic political scene, especially, there's supposed to be an election. Obviously, that's not going to happen because of martial law, but people thinking about leadership and whether they are getting the right leadership.
In a way, that's what they're fighting for, isn't it? To be a democracy, to be a country where you have the space to voice your opinions, where you have the ability to sack your leaders. People want that ability. The fact that they're in this extraordinary conflict, this brutal conflict, complicates things. But I don't think it's surprising. Churchill sacked his top generals as well. I think there's some acceptance that people at the top of the military are going to change. The summer offensive last year didn't work. It failed. What the Ukrainians didn't work. They spread out their forces. They had all this kit, all this equipment provided to them by the West. They didn't concentrate it in one place or one or two places. I think in the minds of many, there is a need for a change in strategy. And I can tell you that the Ukrainians, along with the countries in the West, they regularly war game options. They're constantly thinking about how to do this, what to do when they do get the chance to go on the offensive. So they're not sitting back and accepting their fate. I don't think Zelenskyy at the moment has anything to worry about. I think people understand and realize that he needs a solid position from which to make decisions. I haven't heard any criticisms on the front line of the high command. I think at the moment, the structures at the top enjoy the support and loyalty, particularly of the troops on the ground.
If we're talking about a year of reconstitution, a year of rebuilding, and this might be a bit hard because we've seen so much ebb and flow in this war, but if we're having this conversation in another 2 years' time, what do you think we're talking about?
Well, we know that the Ukrainians are really determined. They're really committed. They are unified. I can't see that changing. That is the strongest asset they have. The fact that they don't want to be part of Putin's Russia, that is probably the strongest weapon they wield. On the other side, we know that the Russians, and we know this from Avdiivka, this logistical town that they finally took after months of trying last week, we know that they are willing to expend the lives of tens of thousands of their soldiers. We know from UK MOD defense estimates that they probably lost something like 400 armored vehicles in that attack. I mean, just massive losses, extraordinary losses. So we know they are willing to endure. To me, that points to more of the same, continuing stalemate, continuing attritional war.
That stalemate, if it does continue the next 2 years, we're in the same place. It's quite easy for people to forget about this. We see it all the time. People get distracted by whatever it is. We've had war between Israel and Hamas. That's taken a lot of attention, something Ukraine has acknowledged as well. We're going to have an election year. That's going to take a lot of people's attention. Is there the danger that people just forget about this?
I think it's important to ask the question, what's Ukraine going to look like if they lose? Let's talk about the situation then, because I do think that has the power to focus minds. You're looking at a Putin-friendly administration in Kyiv. You're looking at a massive amount of bloodshed, a refugee crisis that would dwarf what we have seen so far. You are looking at a emboldened Russia up against the border of NATO countries with a leader who has expressed a desire to recapture Russia's historical lands in the Baltic states and Poland, for example. I mean, that's a pretty scary prospect, and that is what I would be emphasizing if I were Zelenskyy. The prospect of Russia winning this conflict. It's sobering.
John Sparks, thanks for speaking to us. That's all for the Daily this week, but for more on Ukraine, there's plenty on TV, on the live blog, on our app, and of course on YouTube. And the Daily will be back next week. Thanks for listening.